17th and 21st. And hopefully you had an opportunity to look those over. And if we would accept a motion on those minutes. So moved. Thank you, Senator Peterson. Is there a second? Second from Senator Fagg. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. Today we have an informational brief from Lanny Nickel, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Southwest Power Pool. He's going to give us a brief, and then we're going to try to get it hopefully done in time so that we can ask some questions of Lanny and find out whether we'd like to know about Southwest Power Pool and their operations. I think there will be some questions on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Nickel, and you've got the floor, Lanny.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thanks to Senator Thompson, Peterson, and Francisco for the opportunity to be here today and to present to you a little bit of information about Southwest Power Pool, who we are, and kind of what our focus is right now as we work toward our ever continuing mission of keeping the lights on today and in the future. I do have a slide deck. I understand that has been made available.
It is, and we've got it. And by the way, for anybody who's watching online, you should be able to access that by going to the ks.gov website, navigate to committees, Senate committees, and then to utilities, and then under the utilities, there's click on for the testimony, committee testimony, look for today's date, and should be able to pull up that PDF. Sorry to interrupt, Lanny. You can go ahead now.
Yeah, no problem at all. And in fact, I've got it up in front. You should be able to see it on the screen as well.
We've got it. Yes, sir.
Good. All right. Well, let me begin. Again, want to talk to you today about the challenges that we have and the opportunities at the same time as we strive to keep the lights on in an increasingly complex and uncertain future. I will focus quite a bit on the winter event that we experienced last year, because that is a stark reminder of the fact that the future is always uncertain, and there's always an opportunity to have an extreme event that, while it may not happen very often, when it does happen, the impacts can be quite large. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to be more aware of in the future, prepared for, and just be preparing to make sure that we do our job in the best possible way. So I'll focus on that a little bit and talk to you also a little bit about our strategic plan, and trying to prepare for what I believe to be a utility industry that is at a peak in terms of rate of change. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the future. Just real quick though, for those of you who aren't as familiar with SPP, I want to give you an introduction. And again, I can answer questions at any time, or if you prefer to wait till the end, that's certainly fine with me too. SPP has actually 110 members. We just added another member as of the beginning of February. And we've actually seen a little bit of growth in our membership, particularly since the winter event. We've had at least a half a dozen new members join since then, and I'm excited to announce that 2 of those new members are in the gas industry. Prior to the winter event last year, we didn't have any gas companies that were members of Southwest Power Pool. We now have one that is a transmission or a transportation company, and then we have another one that is a gas producer. So it's exciting to see that, because we do need those kinds of voices around the table if we're going to solve some of these challenges and some of the opportunities that are in front of us, because the utility industry heavily relies on fuels to run the generation that we have, and gas is certainly one of our predominant fuels in SPP. But what I want to point out here, in addition to that, is just the fact that we are very diverse. We have members that are IOUs, we have members that are cooperatives, members that are municipals, investor-owned, transmission companies, power marketers, state agencies, large retail customers. We even have some that are what we call alternative power or public interest. And then we have one federal agency as well. So a lot of different perspectives are generally around our table as we're debating policies and needs for our system and the way we operate it. Our current footprint, as you can see, does cover the entire state of Kansas. We also cover all or parts of 13 other states, really beginning at the panhandle of Texas and working our way north till we get to the Canadian border. So you can see the states that we do cover as a regional transmission organization, which just simply means that we have responsibility to not only operate the transmission facilities within this region, but also to plan for and make sure that the appropriate transmission is being built in order to be able to continue to operate the grid reliably. Now, we don't own any of the assets. Those are owned by the utilities that are members of SPPs, but we do operate them and we plan for them and make sure that we have appropriate policies in place that will allow us working with the utilities to keep the lights on today and in the future. And that's an important concept. This is a community of a lot of different roles that have to be played and have to be played in the right way in order to help us be successful in performing our mission. It's not just something SPP staff can do. It's something that all of us working together in this industry, particularly within our region and within our footprint, in order for us to be successful. I will note that we're also expanding, or at least working to expand some of our services to the west. We are already operating what we refer to as an energy imbalance market. And you can see where that is operated in Wyoming and parts of Colorado and parts of Arizona and Utah. Some of those utilities that are operating in that imbalance service market have also expressed interest in joining the regional transmission organization. And when that is successful, we will be providing the whole suite of services that we provide to our members in the eastern footprint as well. So a lot of things are happening, and I do believe that as we continue to expand the provision of our services, and particularly with the expansion of the RTO in the West, it's going to provide a lot of opportunity, a lot of benefit, because today we operate in the western part of the eastern interconnection, and we are connected to the western interconnection by virtue of 7 direct current ties. And if we can find a way to optimize energy exchange across those ties, then that will provide tremendous value. It'll allow us to export a lot of our wind energy when we don't need it, and it will allow us to import, for example, solar energy or other kinds of energy. It doesn't matter what kind it is. When we have excess, it's nice to be able to export that to other buyers. And when we have a need and others have excess, it's nice to be able to import that. And in fact, we saw that benefit come to fruition dramatically during our winter event last year. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We finished our most recent strategic planning exercise last year. We try to do this about every 3 to 5 years. And I'm very proud of our newest strategy. And you can see we put every component in our strategic plan on a single page. We refer to that as our strategy on a page. You can see our mission and our vision. I'm not going to read every one of the elements to you, but I will point out that we hold our mission dearly, and it's not just something that SPP Inc. holds dearly, but our members working with us hold that dearly as well, because it says that we're all in this community going to work together to responsibly and economically keep the lights on today and in the future. And that's very important that we work together in that regard. I want to point out some of our strategic opportunities. You can see, I talked a little bit about Western expansion. That is one of our strategic opportunities that we're focused on. But really more importantly for our current membership, we're focusing on developing that grid of the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because the reason that's important is because, as I mentioned earlier, the industry is changing, I think, at a rate of change I've never seen before. If you looked at our generator interconnection queue, you would see over 40,000 megawatts of solar generation that developers wish to connect to the grid. And today we don't have a lot of solar. In fact, it's very minimal, about 200 megawatts. That's much less than 40,000 megawatts that's being requested. We've seen the evolution of wind. A decade ago, wind represented about 6% of our energy mix. Last year, it represented about 34% of our energy mix. So a lot of change is occurring, and a lot of change will continue to occur. And not discounting the fact that as that change is occurring, we're experiencing extreme winter events, and there's going to be others. There could be drought conditions. There could be any number of different types of extreme events that we need to be prepared for so that we can operate not only affordably, but also reliably. All right, so let me just recap last year's winter event. As many of you may recall, this was an event that lasted for over a week, so the duration of it was quite unprecedented. And then just the temperatures themselves that lasted for as long as they did were very unprecedented in many parts of our footprint. In fact, you can see that our region was really the coldest region in the entire United States. The majority of our footprint experienced temperatures below 0 degrees for the 3 days of February 14th through the 16th. We had a number of all-time records set in certain parts of our footprint. Most of those were in the southern part of the footprint, but it was extremely cold across the entire 14-state region. Now, we foresaw some of this happening, and we didn't quite know exactly how extreme it was going to be, but like, many of the nation, we were paying attention to the weather forecast, and we knew that it was going to be a really cold event. So we did issue a number of different alerts and communications to our utilities, trying to make sure that they were being as prepared as they could be. And certainly we were ramping up efforts to try to make sure we could be prepared as well. Ultimately, we began to commit generation 4 days in advance of when we thought we would experience the worst part of the event. So that was on Thursday, February the 11th. And if you recall, we ended up having to curtail load on February the 15th. That lasted for a little less than an hour. And really impacted only about 1.5% of our demand at the time. And then again on the 16th, impacted about 6% of our demand at the time and lasted for about 3 hours. But to prepare for that, we actually began to commit generation several days in advance. We wanted to make sure that they had the necessary fuel procured, particularly recognizing that the weekend was coming and that we also had a holiday on Monday. We wanted to make sure that they were making plans to procure fuel, that they were beginning to do whatever they needed to do to start their long lead time generators, and so forth and so on. So we don't typically do that. In fact, I think we've only used that capability one other time in our history. We generally wait until the day ahead to start committing generation. But this was going to be an unusual event, and we recognized the situation as such. So, and then you can see that the day before we had to shed load, we actually asked our utilities to begin asking their customers to conserve energy. We do think that helped because we saw that the demands on Monday and Tuesday were not as high as what we had previously thought they were going to be, looking at the day ahead and 2 to 3 day ahead forecast. So we think that helped. Ultimately, though, like I said, we did have to interrupt load on Monday and Tuesday. And then as things began to get better, temperatures began to increase, consumption began to reduce, we were able to ultimately restore to normal operations on Saturday the 20th. Now, we were grateful for every bit of energy that we could get during this time, but it was sparse. We had a lot of generating resources that were simply not available. I'll expand on that in a minute. But what we could get, we appreciated entirely. And so you can see what constituted the energy that we had available to us to meet the demand that we were experiencing on the 15th and 16th. And I'll just note that coal did provide the majority of our energy at that time. You can see that gas provided quite a bit of energy. And then, of course, some of the others such as wind, nuclear, and hydro. Want to point out here that we received a lot of help from our neighbors. The very top part of that graph, kind of shaded in purple or a light purple, is the amount that we were importing from our neighbors. And the reason this is important is because if we hadn't had, and at times that was about 6,000 megawatts, and at times it represented about 14% of our energy demand. If we had not received the assistance that we had been, we would have had to curtail much more load for much longer periods of time. So we're grateful for that help. We don't usually, in fact, normally SPP is exporting energy to our neighbors, not importing. The other comparison I want to make, I mentioned that at times we were importing about 14% of our demand. Compare that to what ERCOT is able to do. And the reason I point that out is because ERCOT is heavily isolated from the rest of the grid. They have 2 direct ties to SPP, and those ties enable them to import up to about 800, a little over 800 megawatts of energy. That represents about 1.5% of their demand at that time. SPP was able to import 6,000 megawatts, which represents 14%. That was tremendously helpful to us. The fact that we have strong interconnections with a lot of generation and a lot of transmission in the Eastern Interconnection, the fact that we have provisions and seams agreements with our neighbors allowed us to rely heavily on our neighbors, and that proved to be really beneficial to us. And as part of the reason why the amount of customers and the lengths of the interruptions those customers experienced were not nearly as drastic as what most of Texas saw that operates in the ERCOT region. So this slide, this chart really shows why we had to interrupt load. We had an all-time low in capacity relative to what we should have seen and what we have historically seen. Now we have about 94,000 megawatts of nameplate generating capacity in SPP. And what that means is that if every generator in our footprint was able to produce the maximum amount according to their rated capacity, we would see 94,000. Now we only have 50,000 megawatts of summertime peak demand, so we don't ever need that much, but that's what we could produce if every generator was operating at its maximum. Accredited capacity, we have about 62,697 megawatts. That's represented by the blue bar in this chart. That's the amount. Accredited capacity represents the amount of generation we expect to have available to us when we need it the most during peak conditions. Historically, during this time of year, during the month of February, we've seen almost 56,000 megawatts of generation available to us. During this event, and a lot of it was due to lack of fuel, a lot of it was due to just simply the cold affecting the ability of the generator to operate, but we only had a little less than 40,000 megawatts of generating capability available to us. We had load that was higher than that, and you can see it was around 43,000 megawatts on February 16th. Somebody's got to make up that difference, and if we're not importing it, which at times we were, but there were times we weren't, then that's what caused us to have to interrupt load, because we have a need, a requirement in order to keep the lights on to continuously balance supply and demand. And when supply isn't there, the only way we can reliably make up for that is to interrupt demand. If we don't, then we expose the grid to much worse conditions, which often lead to cascading outages that occur in an automated way. And once that occurs, there's no telling how much load could have ultimately been interrupted, and it would have been very, very difficult to restore the system during those conditions. So we did what we had to do in a proactive way in order to maintain the integrity of the grid. It was a last resort. It's not something that we ever want to do, but ultimately we did have to take the action of interrupting load because we just didn't have enough generation available. Now this chart shows the breakdown of the types of generation and how much of it showed up during the most extreme part of the event. So you can see that coal, we have 22,000 or 22 gig of coal that's accredited capacity. That's what we should be able to see when we need it the most. Historically, it's produced about 20,000. During this event, it produced about 17. So it didn't quite perform up to our expectations. Gas was the worst performer of the different types. We've accredited 30,000 megawatts of gas generation. Historically, we've seen about 25,000 during February, and it only produced 13,000. Now, again, the biggest reason for the gas deficiency during this event for SPP was the lack of fuel that was provided to our utilities with gas generation. On the other hand, wind, we've accredited 4,000 megawatts or 4 gigawatts of wind capacity. Historically, it's produced around 7,000 during the month of February, and it produced during this event about 4,000. So you might say, based on what we expected, wind performed exactly as we had hoped it would. Nuclear, same way. 2,000 megawatts of nuclear accredited. It's about what we've always seen historically, and that's what showed up during this event. Hydro, a little less than what was accredited, but matched its historic capability. So I just wanted to kind of point that out because this is going to lead to several of our recommendations for improvements going forward. So already talked about, oh, by the way, we did produce a report. I want to make sure that you're aware of that. It is available on our website. And if you have any trouble finding it, please reach out. Let me know. I'll make sure I can get you pointed in the right place. But that report was done. It took about 3.5 months after the event concluded. We presented it to our board last July, and the board accepted the report and directed further action. But we included 7 key observations about the event. The first one being that the real root cause for SPP was just the fact that we didn't have enough generation. That's why we had to shed load. And fuel, the lack of fuel, was the biggest reason for that generation unavailability. We saw extremely high gas prices. And those high gas prices were the primary drivers of record high energy offers in our market footprint. We saw offers over $4,300 a megawatt hour. And historically, on average, for the year of 2020, it cost about $17 a megawatt hour. So the average annual price in 2020 was $17. We saw during this event a price of $4,300, and that was heavily driven by the fact that natural gas was extremely high. I'm not going to talk about, or at least not really focus on a lot of the rest of these, but I do want to mention the fact that, we had the interconnection capacity that we have with our neighbors is what allowed us to import previously unforeseen amounts of energy. And that's the 6,000 megawatts that I mentioned earlier. So we were thankful that we had those relationships with neighboring entities, and we had a strong transmission grid that interconnected us with them. I will also note that there were a few locations on our own transmission system that were congested, which just simply means that there were locations in our footprint where the transmission capability was not sufficient to allow full use of all generation to be delivered reliably to all parts of the system. And that primarily occurred between the northern part of the footprint and the southern part. There were certain generation assets in the northern part of the footprint that we had to back down in order to protect overloading the transmission system that ties the two parts of our footprint together. All right, and then I'll just focus on observation number 7. Our stakeholders, which include our members, our regulators, and our customers, did indicate that they were generally satisfied with our communications efforts, both before and during the event, but we recognize the need for improvements. And I've always said it's important to get the communications right. And so we are going to make some improvements there. In fact, some of them have already been made, but we do intend to get better in terms of our communications for future events. Okay, and I'm going to pause and take a drink of water. All right, so after we finished the report and the board accepted it, we did point out to the board, that our board of directors, that there were 22 recommendations for directional improvements. So I want to be careful, because there were over 100 different, very specific ideas that were generated during our stakeholder communications over the 3.5-month period where we were reviewing the event and trying to find out how we should best improve. So we kind of consolidated those into 22 directional objectives that we recommended to the board. And we kind of prioritized those into 3 different categories. The first level of priority would be what we call Tier 1 recommendations, and these are what we consider to be necessary and urgent because they help us address the root cause. And the root cause in this case, again, was the fact that we didn't have enough generation, and that fuel was the biggest reason for that. We had 18, in fact, let me just move on. This is actually more indicative of what I'm talking about here. We had 13 recommendations that were what we refer to as Tier 2. And again, these are urgent, they're necessary, but they don't necessarily address root cause. And what that means is that if we address the root cause by addressing the Tier 1 recommendations, we should not have to shed load in the future because we've addressed the root cause. On the other hand, if we're not able to entirely address the root cause and we have another event in the future where we need to shed load, then we want to make sure that we can respond as effectively as possible. And that's what the Tier 2 recommendations help us do. Doesn't help us avoid the need to shed load, but helps us respond in a much better way. And then finally, Tier 3, those are our recommendations, and we have 5 of those that will just help us. They're not as critical, not as urgent, but will help us do better in the future and provide value. And you'll notice that a lot of our communications recommendations fall across the tier 2 and tier 3 categories. The ones I want to point out the most here, though, are the ones that address the tier 1 or the root causes. We have 2 recommendations that are intended to improve our fuel assurance, and 2 that are intended to help us better plan for generating resources and for those resources to be available when we need them. So these 7 actions are actions that the board took after receiving the report and accepting it. They directed work to begin immediately on the tier 1 recommendations. They directed us to prioritize work associated with the others, the tier 2 and tier 3, recognizing that our organization has other work that is also important, and I just want to make sure that we're working on the right things at the right time. They directed the staff of SPP to provide quarterly updates on progress being made. And then, of course, they wanted to better understand the timing of when we're going to be able to address tier 1 recommendations. They also directed us to issue letters to all of the utilities that own and operate generation in SPP, requiring them to inform us of their plans to have and maintain fuel to assure that their generation is available for this upcoming winter. Now, the upcoming winter is almost behind us, and so far we've survived. Of course, the weather has not been nearly as bad as last winter, but that was something we did last year prior to this winter. And then finally, to perform some additional root cause analyses to help us better understand why the natural gas fuel was not available to us in the amounts that we needed it during the event. So the first thing that we did after those 7 directives were given, we created what we're referring to as an improved resource availability task force. This task force consists of 12 members, 6 of which are from our regulatory community and 6 of which are members of SPP, member utilities of SPP. In fact, I'm pleased to note that the Kansas Commission has a staff person that is engaged in one of the 6 regulatory representatives on this task force. But the task force was formed to really address those tier 1 recommendations that I mentioned earlier. And here they are written out. So they're the 2 that relate to fuel assurance. One is to develop policies that enhance fuel assurance to improve the availability and reliability of generation in SPP. The second one is to evaluate and, as applicable, advocate for improvements in gas industry policies, including use of gas price cap mechanisms needed to assure gas supply is readily, affordably available during extreme events. Now, I'll tell you, we don't have any control over that. While we do have control over how the generation and the electric usage within our footprint occurs, because we can develop policies around that, we don't have any control over the gas industry. So what we decided to do is at least put ourselves in a position to advocate, and then leave it up to decision makers, some of which may be you, to understand, to be informed, and to make change as change is needed and useful. Then the 2 around resource planning and availability. The first one is to perform initial and ongoing assessments of minimum reliability attributes that we need in the resource mix operating in SPP. The second one is to improve or develop policies, which may include required performance of seasonal resource adequacy assessments, development of accreditation criteria, incorporation of minimum reliability attribute requirements, and utilization of market-based incentives that ensure sufficient resources will be available during both normal and extreme conditions. So I will tell you this, we've got our hands full with these because when we laid out a schedule with the task force, we recognize that it's going to take a lot of serious debate in order to get it right. It may sound easier than it is, but the real truth is that while we definitely want to keep the lights on, and while we need to better understand the characteristics of the generating capacity that is available to us, and we need to make sure that we're accounting that correctly, we understand that that could create a lot of cost. If we don't do it the right way, in fact, we could create cost that doesn't provide value. And our goal is to create value, even if it means additional cost, because we need to keep the lights on, but we need to do it in the most affordable way possible. So it's a balancing act, and it's going to take about 2 years in order to finish this effort, where ultimately we have policies in place that we think will provide us a much better chance of mitigating any future event from resulting in shedding load in the future. So I guess, Chairman, I wonder if it'd be a good time now to entertain questions, or do you want me to go ahead and proceed?
Actually, you've hit it just, you were reading my mind. You've covered an awful lot of territory, and I think there's probably questions from the committee that they would like to know. And before we go on, if we have time to go on, but I wanted to open it up so we have plenty of time to ask questions. The committee, do you have any so far from Lanny? Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lonnie, thank you for being here. I often use the SPP website to decide which is the best night to plug in my electric car. And I'm looking at your forecast for wind and then how much wind is actually generated. You're really good, or the SPP is really good at that forecast. But I'm wondering why, or what's the reason on those times when we have really high wind forecasts that the actual wind used tends to be slightly under that? Is it a matter of transmission capacity?
Senator Francisco, thanks for your question. And yes, oftentimes it is. If we are forecasting particularly when we're forecasting a large amount of wind, we do experience from time to time congestion on the transmission grid that causes us to have to dispatch some of that down, and then causes us to not realize the amount of wind that we had originally thought we would actually have available to us. And sometimes we're just off, by the way. We're not perfect. And sometimes we just over forecast. Sometimes we under forecast. And when that happens, when we see times that the wind shows up either more or less than what we had thought, then we have to rely on other types of generation to be able to fill in the gaps. And that's why, at least now, it's important to have really quick starting and fast responding gas generation available to us to be able to deal with the intermittency, and particularly when we don't forecast the intermittency correctly on renewable resources like wind. Now, I know I mentioned the fact that we've got about 40,000 megawatts of solar in the queue. We've also got a fair amount of battery storage, and it's possible that as that technology materializes and is developed, that it can serve some of the purpose that gas generation serves today.
Thank you. And so I think our next days of really high wind forecasts are between the 4th of March and the 6th and 7th of March. So I think the other question I had is some of that nuclear power is being generated, and we need to make sure that we're using that power. I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can do to strengthen our grid and make as much of that wind resource available as possible.
Well, certainly, when it's prudent to do so, we do need to add transmission infrastructure to make sure that we're delivering the most affordable resources available to us. And we do, on an annual basis, perform transmission planning studies that consider that aspect to make sure that, where it's the right thing to do, where it's prudent to do so, that we can direct the addition of transmission infrastructure that will enable unmitigated delivery of those kinds of resources. It's not always prudent to do so. In other words, sometimes the transmission solution is more expensive than the benefit of delivering in an unmitigated way all types of resources. But that is part of our value calculation that we perform when we do those planning studies.
Senator Olson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it kind of leads into a little bit of what I was curious about. I've heard Mike Ross over the years talk a lot about the grid. The battery storage, it sounds like it's ramping up, but I was just kind of curious where that is. I think that's a key part of our future to the grid, being able to store in these big battery all over the Southwest Power Pool. So how many megawatts and what's the projection? I don't know, maybe if you could get us a slide or something to see how that expands. I think that would be nice.
Yeah, so Senator Olson, thanks for the question. In your background materials, now this is part of the appendix, so I wasn't planning on covering it, but since you gave me the opportunity to do so, I will. This is the slide that I have in front of you now on the screen, which is slide 31 in your package, shows the generator interconnection requests that are currently under study. And you can see that we have a little over 13,000 megawatts of storage in our queue today, which is, behind solar and wind, but I do think it's coming. And I don't remember the exact amount. I want to say that in 10 years, we expect to see maybe around 5,000 megawatts or so, according to our transmission planning studies. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I recall hearing. So, but again, this technology is being developed. And will continue to be developed, and I think at some point will become a very viable resource. But it takes time to get it interconnected. It takes time to build the transmission, and so it's a little slow coming, but it will happen.
Just a comment, 9 years ago, we had 20 megawatts. So yeah, it's really ramping up quick, and I think that's going to be one of the futures to power and how we operate in this country. Thank you.
You betcha.
Any other questions? Senator Hawk?
Thank you for your presentation. On slide 9, during Uri, I'm kind of looking at the different sources of energy that we had available. I'm looking at the bottom at wind. How reliable was wind during Uri? And I assume this is the SPP. I think Texas or ERCOT had many more difficulties with reliability from all sources. Could you share how reliable you think wind was and what the differences were between SPP and what happened in Texas?
You bet. I'll do my best to at least provide some perspective related to wind. We have about 27, at the time at least, we had about 27,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity that was wind generation. And you can see here, the amount of energy produced varied anywhere between, looks like maybe around 6,000 megawatts to as low as about 3,000. And during the most extreme time on the 16th, is around 4,000 megawatts. So you might say, well, gosh, you had 27,000 megawatts and only 4,000 megawatts showed up. That's not good. But on the other hand, our accreditation practices, our accreditation methodologies for wind had it pegged really spot on. And that's where this information comes in handy. We had only expected during extreme conditions or during times when we need it the most, we only expected about 4,000 megawatts to show up. So we didn't undercount it or overcount it in this case. Now, I will tell you, though, that it's possible we could have had even more wind show up, except for the fact that about 7,000 megawatts of our 27,000 megawatts of wind generation actually was experiencing frozen turbines due to icing conditions that actually had begun to occur about a week in advance of this particular event. And the problem was, the icing buildup on the turbines. They never unfroze. The conditions just continued to stay cold. And even though it had developed over a week in advance, they just never were operational because of that. So they were affected, just like all of our generation was affected in some way, in some form, by the extreme cold conditions. But in terms of at least what we expected to happen, we got about what we expected. And I think that's a good thing, because you have to know what you can count on so that you can make preparations for other mitigating solutions. Does that help? I didn't compare it to ERCOT because frankly, I don't have information in front of me right now about ERCOT. I know that they were experiencing similar conditions. I think more of their problems were due to just simply freezing equipment, and the generators weren't able to perform because of some of that freezing equipment. I think in SPP, more of our problem was due to fuel and lack of fuel than it was freezing equipment. But nevertheless, very similar circumstances. I think we just perhaps were a little better prepared. We've got generation in the northern part of our footprint in the Dakotas, Nebraska. They're accustomed to the cold conditions and have prepared their generation to operate in that way. And so I think we were less exposed to those kinds of issues compared to ERCOT.
Thank you. I got a couple questions, Lanny, with regard to reliability and the assets that we need to stay online for reliability. Does the SPP compensate Kansas customers like Evergy for providing that reliability?
In some ways we do, in some ways we don't. So for the investment that's needed to install generating capacity, those costs are recovered by the utilities in accordance with their commission oversight. So in Kansas, it'd be the Kansas Corporation Commission that would oversee recovery of those kinds of costs. When those generating assets operate in our market, the fuel and operating costs are recovered through the market mechanisms. So
There's
in
your
some
cost
ways,
recovery
it's
mechanism.
ratepayers that would pay for it. In some ways, it's the market that pays for that.
So in other words, like your cost recovery mechanisms that allows them to recover the ECA, energy cost adjustment, stuff like that, correct?
Yeah. So it would, I guess, unburden to some extent ratepayers' cost if others are helping to pay for the fact that generation is being used.
Gotcha. With regard to the nameplate capacity versus actual available.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the things that we are looking at as a future improvement is to better value the reliability attributes that some generators are capable of providing. And if that is added as a market mechanism, then that would provide another way to offset costs that ratepayers are currently exposed to. So I just want to make sure that you were aware of that too.
And I appreciate that very much, because that kind of leads into where I was going with this is, we've got, SPP has, you said 94,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity. And with regard to the max peak usage during Winter Storm Uri, I think we ended up with, there's 44,000 megawatts of excess capacity overhead, and a large chunk of that wasn't available. So, and I think Kansas represents about 18% of the load capacity for the entire 14-state region. Are those numbers still approximately correct?
I would think that's close. I don't have it in front of me, but I would say that's probably pretty close, if not right on.
So we're a very big chunk of the generation for the Southwest Power Pool. Is there any way that you could see that you could work with Kansas to? Part of the problem is that we seem to be paying for a large portion of the transmission lines, a large portion of the generation capacity. Is there any way that you foresee that we could work with Kansas to try to help contain our costs and keep our electrical rates down?
I would love to be able to say yes, but we are jurisdictional to FERC, and I don't know how we would have to consider how to make that a part of our tariff and a mechanism that FERC would find just and reasonable. Certainly, we want to work with all of our states and ensure that that the costs are proportionately equitable, and certainly that the benefits received for those investments are in excess of the cost. And
with regard to when SPP charges the state, I think it's 39.4 cents per megawatt hours. That was in the London economic study. Is that based on actual generation or nameplate capacity? I'm just curious about that.
That would be based on actual. I'm not familiar with that number, but in any charge, or any pass-through of market revenues and cost would be based on actual usage.
Okay, I've always had that question about that. And then what portion of the investments in transmission do you know is being used for renewables? Do you have any idea on that?
No, I don't. I apologize. I don't have any.
Okay.
Any real good sense of that.
Gotcha. Any other questions, committee? I think you've covered quite a bit here. We're just about out of time. That website, your report you mentioned, that's available on the website?
It is. Yes, sir.
That covers all this stuff?
Yes, sir. Now it's a lengthy read. So get ready to read a lot of really technically boring information, but hopefully you capture what you need out of the executive summary. But anyway, I know some people really like to read that kind of stuff, so have at it if that's who you are. Yeah,
that's I took a look at it, and it's light reading for a weekend. By the way, I think you said there was 2-year timeline on working out some of the logistics of that report. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, sir. For the recommendations that are being responsive to our root causes, those are the 4 tier 1 recommendations. We're expecting to be able to finish all of the initiatives related to those in about 2 years. Now that's 2 years from actually last fall, so a little less than 2 years from now. But I will tell you some of the other recommendations, and specifically the ones that aren't quite as costly or don't impact a large part of our company and our membership. We've already finished a lot of those. The communications ones, for example, we've got a link on our website that any customer, whether you're a retail customer, wholesale customer, member, it doesn't matter. Government official, doesn't matter. You can go to our website, and if you want to receive information about any abnormal or unusual operating condition, all you have to do is sign up to that, and you can get the same communication that we would send to our members. So that's just an example of one of the communications improvements we've made and is already in place.
Very good. And that is www.spp.org. So I think you
That's
can get all
correct.
that information there. Lanny, we are out of time. I appreciate your report. And I know committee, if they have any questions, they may contact you directly. With that, committee, tomorrow we're going to be working, oh goodness, a pipeline bill. Let me see which bill number that is, which 2329, House Bill 2329. We're going to, actually, we'll be not working. We're going to have a hearing on that bill tomorrow. So come prepared to work on that. And with that, we are adjourned.